Good evening, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's Story Survive program about the Cello Still Sings. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, which is the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So that is the Zoom Q&A box, not the chat. So today we are so honored to be joined by Janet Horvath. Janet is a lifelong performing classical musician, soloist, speaker, writer, and anti-racism spokesperson. The associate principal cello of the Minnesota Orchestra from 1980 to 2012, she's performed in recital and chamber music throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe, on CBC, BBC, and NPR radio stations, and on PBS television. Her work has been described by reviewers as lyrical, gripping, entertaining, and a heartfelt story vividly and powerfully told. So we are very lucky to have her with us this evening. You can purchase The Cello Still Sings at the link in the chat. So thank you all so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Janet.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm really pleased to be able to share my story. So I'm going to share my screen, and since you know I'm a cellist, we're going to begin with a little music. So that should be interesting for you, I hope. Okay, we're going to go back to the beginning. Okay, so my book, The Cello Still Sings, A Generational Story of the Holocaust and of the Transformative Power of Music, came by an accident, and I'm going to tell you how I was able to unravel the mystery of my parents' past. And as you heard, I've been a professional musician all my life, as was my father, and no one knew that I had this background, even my closest friends. So I will now proceed to the opening number. The lovely artwork is by a local plein air painter, impressionistic painter from Stillwater, Minnesota, Cami Mendlick. So my father, my parents, George and Catherine Horvath, were both professional musicians from Budapest, Hungary, as well as being Holocaust survivors. Who would think that this elegant couple had suffered with starvation, deprivation, and terror? Beneath the veneer, our family was haunted by the eerie hush surrounding their experiences. Music was our lifeline. As that generation passes away, so many of us, as we call ourselves G2, are obsessed about researching the secrets of our past, to learn our history, to determine to leave a lasting legacy for the future. But digging into the past seemed impossible. My parents never spoke about it. But we didn't need to hear the words to understand the tune, which oozed into our genes. We gleaned that we had to succeed in ways they couldn't and live for those who didn't. I often will start by reading the flap of my book, which gives you a good sense of what it was like at home. The cello sound before conscious memory permeated my very being, its lush golden tones the closest sound to the human voice. My earliest memories are of lying on the floor next to my father as he practiced the cello, the metronome marking the music's pulse. My parents never considered that my petite stature and tiny hands were not ideal for playing the cello or carrying the bulky beast in and out of vehicles and up staircases. Nevertheless, engulfing the instrument with my body in an embrace, I endeavored to produce the seductive sounds my father coaxed out of his cello. They remained devoted to making this a more beautiful world through music, but their past remained shrouded in silence. Over the years, I grew obsessed with the Holocaust, reading everything I could on the subject. I tried to imagine, then tried not to imagine, what my parents might have gone through. My core harbored the unspeakable, at times crushed by the repulsive burden. Breaking free was futile. I had been genetically stamped. In order to make sense of my parents, my upbringing, and ultimately my own baffling anxieties, I resolved to pursue truths about the past. So in the last year of my father's life, he disclosed a deeply hidden secret, and it was unleashed by an innocent question about music. So I was the away daughter, and whenever I would come to Toronto, where my parents emigrated and where I was born, I would try to make up for the woman that wasn't present, and I would rush my parents to the doctor. I would do shopping. I would buy them essentials. And one day I had to take my father to yet another doctor appointment, this time the neurologist, and I was able to get him down the stairs and get the walker in the car and get him in the car without bumping his head. And then I thought, okay, what should I talk about? Because my father was not so good at small talk, and he could be sometimes a really difficult person to just talk to. And I thought, okay, I'm going to ask about music because he loved to talk shop. And he lit up when he would be able to talk about all the famous maestros that he played with in Budapest and the symphony when he was just a 20-year-old young man before World War II. So it was a wretched January day. I'm thinking some of you know what that's like, where it's snowing, it's slushy, and I'm gripping the steering wheel to drive, and I say, Dad, did you ever play with Leonard Bernstein? I'd never asked him that question, my personal idol. And he put his hand to his cheek and he looked up, his eyes seemed to roll into the back of his head. And I thought, oh gosh, what should I do? Should I pull over? What's happening? And I kept going until a minute or two later when it was as if he came to and he said, yes, it was a very hot day. It was in the DP, the displaced persons camp in Bavaria, Germany, in Landsberg. And he came, he was just a kid. And he played Rhapsody in Blue on the piano. And it was just fantastic. And I told him, I talked to him, and I said, I want to come to America. And he said, no, you're such a great Jewish musician. You should go to Palestine. Now, this was in 1948. Here we were, two professional musicians and cellists, and he had never told me this story, never bragged about it, and none of the other stories either. And my father recalled the entire program. He always remembered the music. And I got him home after thinking, before I could even get my tongue around all the questions, which was, what were you doing in Germany? And was my mother with you? And how did you have the strength to play? And where did you get an instrument to play? He shook his head gravely and huddled to the side of the car and wouldn't talk anymore, wouldn't share anymore, or the memory was gone. So that night, after I got him home and tucked in, I raced to Google. I thought surely there would be some record of this important occasion. And I stumbled on a name that my father had remembered. She sang on the program, Henia Dermashkin Gurko, young girl. I thought, well, how many of those could there be? Surely I can find that on Google. And there I found that she had donated a program, a printed program, to the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City. And I thought, wow, a printed program. I wrote to the museum and immediately got an answer the following day. They said, yes, Janet, please make an appointment. The next time you're in New York City, we'd be happy to show you the program in our archives. But don't you want to see the live video testimony and the photographs? That's when I started screaming, thinking, wow, what a find. I got to the museum. Fortunately, the Minnesota Orchestra did a tour that year. It was a run out, as we called it, where we fly in, we spend the night, we have a rehearsal, we can barely grab dinner, and we play the concert. So there was a little window of opportunity early in the morning to race down to Battery Park and to go to the museum. The archivist met me at the door. She donned elbow-length white gloves and reached into these tiny archival boxes and pulled out 4 photographs. And there was my father standing next to Leonard Bernstein. I said, there's my father. The archivist had a copy, a photocopy, and she drew a line to my father's head and said, George Horvath, Toronto, Canada. It was very emotional, as I'm sure you can imagine. And here's my father in his prime in the Toronto Symphony for 38 years. Here's the program. So my first thought was, oh, I'm going to have to get somebody to translate this. It's all, and then I realized that it's in Yiddish. How else would 5,000 displaced persons communicate in this largest DP camp in Landsberg, about an hour from Munich, in the American zone after World War II, 1948. Here is a musician's saved copy, so you can see that it's pretty tattered and yellowed with age. And in fact, he signed the back of this copy for that musician. And here's the group seated, standing, posing with Leonard Bernstein. And this is the photo that I first saw in the museum. My father is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from the left, peeking out from the second row. So while I'm about to hear the video of Henia Dermashkin Gurko, which I'm set up in a little cubicle of a room with a CD, DVD. You remember those things, I hope. The archivist went running to the phone, which I didn't know, because the there are a couple of members of the orchestra whose daughter live in New York. She's actually a trustee of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, Rita Lerner. The archivist called her and said, hey, there's some lady here all the way from Minneapolis, and she's watching your video. I don't know why she's watching this, and you might want to call her. And so I did call her from backstage at Carnegie Hall with everybody, the cacophony going on while we're warming up, and it was as if I'd met a sister, because her mother was Henia Dermashkin-Gurko, and then she led me to her cousin, Sonia Becker, whose parents, both mother and father, were also in this orchestra, sisters, Henia and Fania Dermashkin. So what a find, So I called my father. I said, Dad, I found these photographs in this museum. There you are in the picture. He says, did you see Chaim Arbeitman? I said, who's that? Oh, I sat all the time with him on the bus. I said, what do you mean all the time? Well, there was a 17-member survivor orchestra that was bussed twice a week all over Bavaria, bringing morale-boosting programs to those still languishing in the displaced persons camps, waiting for news of loved ones, waiting for the right paperwork to leave Europe. I couldn't believe that I had stumbled on this story. A little later, after I was able to contact Sonia Becker, she had numerous other photos, and here's the orchestra seated. My father's in the middle, in the last row, with the mustache and the cello, and their parents are in the first row. So my father actually didn't play 2 concerts. Yeah, he played 2 with Leonard Bernstein, both on that one day in May of 1948. But I later found out that my father played in this orchestra from 1946 to 1948. He played 200 concerts in 100 different displaced persons camps. It was for thousands of Holocaust survivors. It was sponsored by the Joint, the JDC, and in return, they received American canned goods of food, and also coffee and sugar and some of those things that were desperately needed at that time. And he played with Leonard Bernstein. The music was transformative, penetrating through the shroud of darkness, transporting those languishing in the camps, filling them with a belief that there might still be beauty in the world and with hope for a better life. But for my father to bring music again to people was and bring solace was a blessing, and attendees never forgot the experience. And I know that for a fact because one of my friends, who was also, her parents were Holocaust survivors, and then he survived Auschwitz and made his way to Landsberg. Her father heard that performance with Bernstein, and in fact would say to her when she was growing up, if he can make such beautiful music from that piano, I can go on living. So I blew up the photos to poster size, and on my next trip to Toronto, this is in 2009, I had a big poster tube, and typically my father would meet me at the elevator, cover my face with noisy smooches, and walk me into his apartment. And I had this poster tube. He says, what you have there in that thing? Let me see. Show me already. Show me. So I, unraveled it and put it on the dining room table. And I have to say that I held my breath because I didn't know what his reaction would be. I didn't know if I would bring him further pain, bringing up memories, whether he would remember anything or whether he would be hesitant to share anything further with me. And then he looked up and he said, here, Janet came. that's me. And he says, I sat with Chaim Arbeitman on the bus. I told you he changed his name to David Arbin, and he got in the Philadelphia Orchestra as if it had been his own accomplishment. So I went back home to my life, my job, my son and husband, and his caregiver called me and said, you know, Lolo George, Grandpa George, he's scribbling late at night. And at that point, he could hardly write because of Parkinson's. I don't know what he's writing, but maybe you should ask him. So the next time I went to Toronto, which was only a few weeks later because I'm rushing back and forth to take care of their needs, I get there and he's not at the door, at the elevator where I get off. The door to his apartment is ajar. I'm surprised. I walk in and he's sitting formally at a dining room table holding these papers with dark scrawl. And he says, Janet came, you come here, you sit down. I read this to you. I thought, oh, what could be so urgent? I just got in. Maybe it's insurance papers or tax records like I'd always done for them. He says, you sit down. Here, I'm going to read you my testimony, what happened to me during the Holocaust. I thought, wow, okay, Dad, could you just wait a second? Let me grab my computer. I thought maybe I could, write it down and translate it. And I have to say that my Hungarian isn't bad. It's pretty good. I can understand pretty much everything. My spelling is atrocious because it's a very difficult language to spell, but also my vocabulary was lacking. I had the vocabulary of a 10-year-old child. So I didn't have the words for lynching poles, gravel pits, wheelbarrows. And a couple of times I did say, Dad, how do you spell that? What does that mean? He says, Janet came, why are you interrupting me every second? And so I thought, okay, I better not. I'll sound out the words and look them up later, just to not get him upset at all. So he told me his entire story, which I'd never heard. So some of you may, or some of you may not know, that Hungary was an ally to Germany. And so the Jews were relatively protected until very late in the war. Now, not to say that there hadn't been anti-Semitism in Hungary. For 1,000 years, there was. Everybody knew who everybody was, and Jews were often beaten up or ostracized. And the earliest laws that were implemented in Europe before the Third Reich was in 1920, when they introduced the numerus clausus laws, which limited the number of Jewish people that could go to universities. And so that's why everybody resorted to going into trades, so sewing and that sort of thing. So my father remembered vividly that he was playing a Sunday afternoon concert with the Budapest Symphony, March 19th, 1944, when the Nazis, especially Hitler, got very impatient with the premier, Horthy, who was protecting his Jews. And he wanted that last large population in Europe. And so they kidnapped Horthy's son and marched in and installed a new leader. And they showed up in the middle of the concert and told everybody they had to finish the concert and that people would be arrested. So things happened very, very quickly in Budapest. Not to say that they hadn't heard rumors, but my mother was determined that this could never happen in Budapest, the epitome of culture and, food and beautiful music. This could never happen here, but I can show them I can work. I can show those Germans. Of course, they didn't believe the rumors that they heard. But as the things quickly escalated, where they had to put the star, they couldn't shop in certain places and only certain times, losing their occupations, they started believing that, you know, maybe the Nazis wouldn't take married women. Maybe if they were married, they'd be okay. And so the young women married en masse overnight, including my parents. So May 26, 1944, my mother had to borrow a dress. She was only 17, so she had to get permission from her parents, and they forged documents that said they were Catholic. They were married by the Justice of the Peace, and the following day, my father was rounded up for slave labor, taken to the copper mines of Yugoslavia in Bor, Yugoslavia, where many hundreds and thousands of Hungarian men were taken. My father believed that it was a death sentence. Of course, it was for many hundreds of Hungarian men, but what he didn't know was that he was on the last train that did not go to Auschwitz. They did it very quickly in Budapest. Eichmann went personally to Budapest to see to this last Hungarian Jewish population in Europe. By 1944, most had been, already put to death. He didn't know that 12,500 people per day, men, women, and children, were hastily deported to Auschwitz. And it happens to be the largest Hungarian cemetery in the world today. My mother was fortunate that she had an older brother who had been rounded up for the munkaszolgálat, meaning the labor service. So the Jewish men were also conscripted, but they had to wear a yellow armband, and many of them were very mistreated, almost as bad as concentration camps. My uncle, who was my father's age, was able to somehow escape. And when it was time for them to round up the women, and they were ordered to go to a big arena, he told her, you watch what they're doing and you come back and report to me what's going on. Just slip from one line to the other if you can. And so in this arena, it was pouring rain, the bullets were ricocheting, the dogs were barking, the Nazis were screaming, the women were crying. It was total chaos. And she was just in terror, slipping, unobserved from line to line. And she noticed that the, sick, elderly, pregnant women, little children were sent to the right, and the beautiful ones, the strong ones, the younger ones to the left. And by the end of the day, they couldn't do everybody. And they said, you come back tomorrow or, we'll bomb your entire family, threatened them. And she raced home, and my uncle said to her, we're going to hide. It's better to perish in freedom than to go to what may be a horrific end. So in this testimony, my father described the brutal work that he had to do as a slave laborer at the copper mines of Bor, Yugoslavia. And meanwhile, between May 16th and July 6th of 1944, 437,402 Jews were deported in less than 8 weeks on 147 trains. I'm going to play a little music now because that takes a lot to take in. So photos like these were popping up all over Hungary. And this is a famous photo that I'm sure many of you have seen. The little boy was never identified, but the Nazi brandishing the rifle is identified when you see the picture. And this is the beautiful Dohány Templom, the large synagogue in Budapest, and I highly recommend touring it if you're in Budapest. It's stunning. But in those days, the Nazis used it as a stable, and this was where they were trying to cordon off the people into a ghetto so that they could deport them more easily. And you may know that it's not usual for Jewish synagogues to have a cemetery in the synagogue. But because so many people did perish in that ghetto, there is a sacred area where there are several people who perished. So when my father was liberated, he wandered in the forest in the winter without shoes or food, covered in lice, and he trudged all the way from Yugoslavia at night, because he didn't want to be found, on straw that had been cut down so it hurt his feet. And he trudged to the border of Hungary. That was some 286 miles if you could walk in a straight line. So I say this to you, and I often say this to the people that come to hear me, and they're mainly non-Jewish people, who some of whom have not encountered this material before. And I say, I'm saying this about my father, but does it sink in? Do I really imagine that my father, who was a wonderful artist, could have done that, could have survived that? So, I don't know if it sinks in even today. So my father was able to keep a photo of my beautiful mother, and I believe that that's what sustained him through these horrible times. And here is my mother right before they decided to make that terrible decision of leaving Europe, which was soaked with Jewish blood. Before he could get there to Budapest, there was a brutal siege of Budapest, and Hitler had said, hold on to Budapest at all costs. So there was street fighting, and there was no food, and nobody thought anybody was Jewish that was remaining in Budapest. And so my mother hid in basements and under lumber, and it would be weeks before my father could get to Budapest, not knowing what happened to his wife and to his mother, and knowing that there had been this brutal siege. So I wanted to read a little excerpt because I know that a lot of people think that the book is mainly about my father, but it's also about my mother, who was very, very strong, who also never spoke about it. And when I left the orchestra, after my father shared these stories with me, we were able to get a documentary that was made by Sonia Becker, who I mentioned earlier. And had they known my father was still with us, he would have been in the film. But as it was, he was in the film in still pictures. And I waited till August of that year, of 2009, my father's health was failing, and I made another trip. And I have to say that I was very worried about watching this video myself. So I waited to watch it with my father. We held hands, and it started, and suddenly there was a close-up of my father on the bus with David Arbin, Chaim Arbeitman, looking like any young group of kids going on some excursion. And my father, I jumped up to the TV and I pointed, said, Dad, there you are. And he says, Janet came. It's me. I had so much hair. And I know that there was a disconnect between him seeing himself and seeing his adult daughter sitting next to him. So once he was able to write this testimony and read it to me, it was just shortly thereafter, only a matter of weeks, that he passed away. And I feel extremely fortunate to have this story. I was able to ask him a couple more questions, which I will go into in a second. And then after mourning, I was able to go to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I was able to go to the Holocaust Museum, Memorial Museum in Washington. And because I speak Hungarian, I was able to go to Budapest and hire a genealogy person and an archivist who could help me go through the records and seek out other information. And I have to say, it felt like it was all falling into my lap. So I found this before my father passed away, and it's an actual Buchenwald certificate, ID paper. My fingers felt like it was singed, and I knew that my father wasn't in Buchenwald. And I said, Dad, like, what's this? How come this is even here with your name? And he says, Janet, Hamish, hat Hamish, meaning it's false, it's false. And he was embarrassed about that. But he then told me that people were stateless. People had no paperwork to say who they were, where they were from. And in order to get any kind of documents to apply for leaving Europe or going to any other country, you had to have proof of who you were. So they falsified this document that had my grandfather's name in it, who was incarcerated in Buchenwald. So just incredible things. This is his visa that he eventually was able to get that does say that they're stateless. And in order to get permission to go to Canada, they needed to say that they were fulfilling jobs that people needed in Canada. So what were they? Well, a farmer and a seamstress, not a professional musician. Who needed those? So that's what they said they were. And of course, at the border, the customs officer said to my father, "These hands have never played, never farmed a day in your life." He says, "But I can learn, So it took a lot of legwork to get the right paperwork. And when I was in the museum, I stumbled on documents like this, which does say that my mother was in the Jewish house in the ghetto, and that she sailed away on September 9, 1948 on the boat Scythia. So I was able to glean all this information just by luck. So one of the documents, and this was at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, I worked with an archivist who said, the Germans were really precise in Germany and Austria, but by the time it happened to Budapest, they weren't keeping records. It happened so fast, we're not going to find anything. And so I was standing above her, and she was going through microfilm very quickly, scanning one document after another, and suddenly I stopped her. "There's my father's signature. I would know that anywhere." And I didn't know when they had arrived in Munich, which was helpful to have the date, August 1946. But I also didn't know that they were there with my father's sister and my mother's brother and his wife. And their names are all on this document. So things like that were just amazing to find. And as I mentioned, I was able to go to Budapest. This was the archivist that I hired, and we went to the huge cemetery that's outside of Budapest and dug through thick foliage and were able to find headstones of relatives. So it was quite unbelievable.
Amen.
I'm going to now skip to the ending. So here is Bernstein. I was able to find more photos. This was actually from the joint, JDC. My father is in the left corner, and here they are playing with Bernstein. And my father here in this picture is to Bernstein's left, standing as close to the conductor, Bernstein, as I played in my career. And this photo was taken of him receiving flowers after the Feldafing concert, but he also got a concentration camp uniform that eventually he had to give away because the stench could not be eradicated. So here he is looking young and debonair. He looks a little like Bradley Cooper, don't you think? Yeah. So before he became the famous maestro that he became. So as maybe you know, I left the orchestra to write this book, and I went back to school knowing I've written another book. It's about injury prevention for musicians, but I knew that I wasn't going to be able to put 70 years of history together without some guidance. And so I went to school, and one of the things that they said was, you musicians, you never know when to end, you musicians, you writers, you never know when to end a book. You are usually going on 50 to 100 pages too long. So you have to end it sooner. And I thought, well, I'm not even sure when to end the book, let alone how. And then one day in 2017, I was in a noisy cafe and I get this call from Europe. Obviously, there are many, many numbers on identifying the call. And I run out, and it's a German accented lady who says, Janet, I'm so happy to finally find you. And what your parents went through is so terrible. And we're going to have a concert 70 years later in 2018 to commemorate this occasion. Would you do us the honor to come to Landsberg, Germany in next year, 2018? I thought, yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, Germany might be nice in May, I suppose. I will have a little concert or something. She says, and you know, Janet, it has to come from people like me, non-Jewish Germans, to teach the next generations. And we really want to replicate the concert. So would you consider and do us the honor to play Kol Nidre on this program? Well, that's when I started welling up, because many of you will know the piece, know that it's the ancient chant that begins our holy day of Yom Kippur. And it's our day of atonement when we're supposed to ask forgiveness of friends, family, colleagues, children, parents, whether we were aware of hurting them or not, and to try to do better in the following year. So to play that in Germany with a student orchestra of German young people, in the very place my father played with Leonard Bernstein, to the day 70 years later, was, I have to say, quite daunting. 40 of us, some of whom were born in Landsberg, showed up there in May of 2018. And it was an unbelievable cathartic experience. So in the town hall, they were able to find the original piano that was used by Bernstein. There were displays all over. And here was the orchestra. They were young, very young, and they sounded like any junior high orchestra would sound. And I tried to whip them in shape, telling them the meaning of the piece, and also then telling the audience what the piece means, not only to the Jewish people, but personally what it meant to my family, because my father played Kol Nidre for 30 years every year as I was growing up in Toronto in our synagogue, and I've played it here in the Twin Cities for 30 years every year. So there's more than 6 decades of playing Kol Nidre and setting the tone for the holiday. So it was extremely emotional. We ascended to a different plane. The way they played, the way I played, was beyond what we knew we could. So it was an amazingly reconciliatory event, and I knew that this was the way I wanted to end my book. Here I am playing the piece, And here is an original member who was still playing in concentration garb. The first concert was at St. Attilian Benedictine Monastery, and they were in 1945. This was before my father had trudged to Budapest, so they had already started playing these concerts. This is after the concert, so you'll see on one side is Sonia Becker, then myself, my brother, my sister-in-law, and on the left is Hannah Ehrlichman, who came from Israel, whose parents were also in this DP camp. And then we were taken to St. Attilian Benedictine Monastery, where the first concert was. They took that name initially, the orchestra did, and here we were, the 40 of us under the sign, taking a picture, wondering what our parents would have thought that here we are 70 years later, in a week-long series of events of bringing us all together. So it was remarkable, and that really music was the conduit to bringing people together. So my book traces my father's career and my own, and I want to tell you that there's humor throughout, really funny stories that I wish I had time to read you. That as a community, we're constantly concerned, I hope, with statelessness that goes on today and displacement, and refugees are still coming to our doors. My intention was to try to lead readers through some of the difficult subject matter via an alternate route. So through a back door, through cello, through music, through knowing me perhaps, so that there are people that hadn't encountered the stories of the Holocaust, and we know that there were much worse than what my parents had to experience. But my mama's voice echoes, it can't happen here. And you know, my mother ingrained in us to never tell anybody we were Jewish because she was certain it could happen again and anti-Semitism would rear its ugly head. But I can't put my head in the sand. I mustn't, because of what they went through, and knowing that I need to speak up and stand up. And so I've been trying to do that with my story. I'm about to do my 75th presentation in a couple of weeks. And my hope is to garner some empathy for refugees, increase knowledge about the Holocaust, about anti-Semitism and racism, but very important as a legacy for the future. And perhaps the arts, especially music, can bring people together. So I want to thank you for listening, and I hope that there are some questions that we can discuss and share.
Janet, thank you so much for that really beautiful presentation, and also for sharing that really amazing music with us. I think it really helped to illustrate the story that you're telling. So thank you for sharing all of that. And we do have lots of questions that are coming in, so I'm going to hop to it. We have a lot of people who are asking about your mother's story. If you can maybe just tell us a little bit more about how she survived the war and where she was.
So I didn't know my mother's story, and she suffered a terrible stroke suddenly, and I suddenly realized that I hadn't asked her anything. I was afraid, and so I thought her stories were lost. And this is a spoiler alert. You don't have to hear this. Plug your ears. But when my mother's Shiva was going on, my cousin came to the door and was like really agitated. And he said, Janet, you have to come in the back room. We have to go. And I'm thinking, what are you talking about? What's going on? There's all these people here. And, yeah, we have to go in the back room. And he said, when we got to the back bedroom, here's the tape I made of your mother when her older brother, passed away a number of years before. And none of us knew that he taped her. He started with just their childhood, so she was, enjoying telling stories of her brother and herself. They were very close, and he gradually brought her to that time. And it was the first time she'd ever divulged any of that.
Mhm.
And I have the tape. I transcribed the tape. It's in the book. And the shocking thing was that it had been 8 years since we had heard my mother's voice because of the
Wow.
stroke. So we initially couldn't get our heads around even what she was talking about, just
Mhm.
listening to her voice. So I bring the two stories together. My mother was able to hide in
Mhm.
bombed out buildings under lumber in coal bins, running from place to place, terrified all the time with no food, literally. But somehow she survived that and wasn't found.
That's amazing. And it's really amazing that your cousin was able to
Oh,
uh, keep
yeah.
that. Yeah. So, you talked about how your family didn't, or most family members, I suppose, didn't really know these stories up until, your father passed away and your mother passed away. So how has your family reacted to hearing these stories and having the book out and having you share it with so many audiences?
So that's often asked.
Mhm.
So initially, my brother, who's a doctor, he's in Toronto, he's got a big family, and he says, Janet, nobody's going to want to know our story. I mean, yeah, our family will, enjoy having it, but, I don't think so. And he's eating his words now because I had amazing reception of the book, and they're very proud now. All the kids have read it. So I'm proud of that.
That's awesome. And yes, you can definitely tell him that we are very happy that you have shared the story with us. So you can send him this video afterwards.
Yeah. Mhm.
So also, you played so many beautiful pieces, and we know that you are a very accomplished cellist. Has learning your parents' story affected you as an artist in any way and as a cellist?
Totally. Yes. Um, the Holocaust infused our lives. It was
Mhm.
always hovering. Not a day went by that we didn't feel something going on, even though, they hadn't told us things. But once I had the story, once I understood how their behaviors were affected by what they experienced, some things started really making a lot more sense. And for me to come out as a Jew and play Kol Nidre, I played it in the big cathedral here for a
Mhm.
special program. I played for September 11th, and playing Jewish pieces, and that enabled me to do that, finding out the story.
Yeah. So this kind of answers another question that came in, but are you still playing the cello? It's obvious that you still are. And do you still have your father's cello?
That's another story that's in here.
Yes.
And it's very interesting because it's a Museum of Jewish Heritage thing again, because I have to say I'm on Facebook a lot. And one day I got a private message, and this woman said to me, and her name was Mary, Mairi, Dorman Phaneuf, Pheu, like a obviously Irish or Scottish name. And she said, I've been trying to track you down because I bought your father's cello and I finally found you. I wanted to tell you that I played Kol Nidre in the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And I told them that this cello belonged to a Holocaust survivor. And I'm playing it again at Temple Emmanuel on the weekend for Yom Kippur. And I,
Wow.
oh my God. And, so I had to call her immediately. And I said, we're going to be playing Kol Nidre at the same time, you know,
Mhm.
and that to think that my father's cello is still playing Kol Nidre um, to this day. So
Yeah.
that's where the cello still sings. That's where the title comes from.
That's amazing. And that was another question we had. So thank you for preemptively answering. So I think we have time for one more question. And I apologize if we weren't able to get to your questions. We had a lot of really amazing ones. But you talked about how you end your book with playing with the students. And you talked about how you kind of shared the importance of the piece with them. And how did they react to hearing your story and your father's story and your mother's as well?
I think they'll never forget the experience. The
Mhm.
parents were just, gaga, that their their kids had this opportunity and they played with all their heart, so beautifully. And I think they really learned something about our heritage and about Judaism, which really mattered to me.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Janet, for being here with us this evening, for sharing all of these amazing stories and this amazing music and for answering all these questions. We really appreciate it. It's been
My,
an honor.
my pleasure. Thank you.